International Relations from Warsaw, Poland, European Union. Welcome to our weekly live talk. We talk about the influence of pandemic and all this crisis we are now in the middle of. The influence on the international affairs, on the relationship between the states, and generally the global order. Normally, we concentrate on Europe, of course, but today we decided to look at Europe and the world from a different perspective. And we have great guests with us this afternoon, coming from two different continents. I'm really very happy both the ladies agreed to join us. We have Vutu Ha. Ha, are you there? Are you listening to us? Everything is working?
Yes, it's fine for me. Hello, everyone.
Perfect. Ha is talking to us from Hanoi, Vietnam. She's a journalist. She's working for the Vietnam News Agency, experienced journalist in writing. Now she also does journalism. So some hours ahead of us. What's the time in Hanoi?
Now it's 10 p.m. in Hanoi.
10 p.m. So late. Yeah. Thank you for sharing the evening with us. And we have also with us Montserrat Xilotl. Montserrat, everything works? Yes?
Yes, fine. Thank you. It's 8 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here. So
yes, because Montse is speaking to us from Mexico City. So she's Mexican. She works as an independent consultant, and she's very experienced in development policies. She works also for UNDP. So we have Mexico, we have Vietnam, and the reason why we've chosen these two countries is because they have big brothers just next doors. Mexico has the United States, and economically, it's of course the very close economy. But Mexico also looks at North America, Latin America, and Europe. And Vietnam has a big brother, has China just next door. And Vietnam is also trying to handle this Chinese rise quite, well. It's not an easy task, but also Vietnam is closer than earlier to the West, to the US even, and to Europe. So both the ladies, I hope I can count on your knowledge, but also I would like to talk about us Europeans, how both of you see what we are doing, and also how both of you and your countries see the European Union from your perspective. But let's first start with your countries. Maybe we'll start with Vietnam. Vietnam, please tell us, because you are a little bit ahead with the pandemic. It was a problem in Asia before Europe. So tell us where you are, how is the reaction of your government and your people on the pandemic, and what's life now in Vietnam?
Yes, thank you for giving the chance to begin with. Our country is kind of back to normal now somehow, because the pandemic here in our country started earlier than Europe and North America and elsewhere. So now it's almost 4 months now since the first case was detected in our country. It was January 23rd that there was the first case detected here, and I can say that the government here has been doing really well in containing the virus. So up to now, although we shared a very long border with China, over 1,000 kilometers of shared border, but we were able to contain the virus to the point that we only record about up until today, we only have 324 positive cases here, and most of them have recovered. About more than 80% of the cases have fully recovered, and we recorded no deaths so far. So it's really a good result. And
maybe it's also because you had earlier the problems with other viruses, and you are experienced much more than
yes,
us
yes,
Europeans how to
yes,
handle
yes,
that.
yes. Right, right. It's one of the reasons, and but the most important reason is that the government, right from the beginning, when we heard there were some kind of like strange pneumonia caused a virus in China, the government here is very cautious, and it initiated very drastic action right at the beginning, even when the country had no cases. Right in early January, when we heard about the disease in China. After the country recorded the first case, even much more drastic action was done. And at that time, schools are closed down, and like systematic measures have been implemented. And even though that the government was somehow criticized by some people that it was like reacting, but in the end, it shows that all the measures prove effective. And we
And
did have
you are also working from home. You are a journalist, a news agency.
yes.
You are also working from home.
Yeah, we used to work from home because the government implement a partial, not really a lockdown, but like a social distancing measures. So it is not like forcing people to stay at home, but encouraging people to stay at home for about 3 weeks in April. Uh, um, so the whole country was put in a situation where people are encouraged to stay home, practicing social distancing. People work from home. Schools are closed for about 3 months. But now everything, because the pandemic is kind of being controlled here, so everything is now back to normal, and we call it new normality. Some measures are still in place, but it's more or less been eased, and business are reopened, and school children are back to school now, and now we no longer work from home. We go to back to the office. So the
Okay,
situation here is quite good at the moment.
under control, under control. Thank you,
It's
Ha.
under
We will come
control.
back to you.
Yeah.
Montse, Mexico is actually a little bit behind Europe. We are in the middle between Asia and North America and South America as far as the reaction on the pandemic. What's now the situation in your country?
So I can give you both two perspectives. So from the regional perspective in Latin America, of course, we got this. We were first hit with the coronavirus later than Asia, later than Europe, a little bit later than the US, like around 2 weeks. With there being a lot of awareness towards the end of March, which was when the first case in Mexico came, and also when other countries in the region started seeing it. So right now, for example, in the region, we're seeing that governments have had different responses. So some have had very strict lockdown measures, like is the case in Colombia, is the case in Panama, whereas other countries have been a lot more lax. The extreme example being Brazil, and Mexico being somewhere in the middle, where there has been some social restriction measures, but they haven't been as enforced as in some areas. So, for example, it has been an economic slowdown, and some measures have been taken, but people can still walk around. You still see some stores being open, of course, with distancing measures, with sanitary safeguards. So right now, for example, you're beginning to see that in Latin America, we have not necessarily flattened the curve. It's still very much an active pandemic. While it's not as extreme as it could have been, it's still, the cases are still rising. So, for example, if you look at the ADB's report on the situational report, right now there are 527,000, around 527,300 cases that are still active in the region. So it is slowly getting to be a larger percentage of the source. In Mexico, Mexico is now the third country that has the most cases, with Brazil being the highest, quickly reaching US levels, followed by Peru and then us, and then Colombia and Chile somewhere there. So it is an active. What we do have that has been helpful a lot is we have public health systems that are quite strong, that I think, and not only are they quite strong, but they're also very well distributed, which is important. Granted, the quality in rural areas is not the level that you have in high specialty areas, such as in Mexico City or in large cities, but you do have this great outreach that allows for a lot of socialization measures to take place. So I think that has been good. What has been a little bit confusing, and I think that this COVID situation has presented not only in my country, but in the region itself, and I think in the rest of the world, is that it's kind of created a mirror to kind of present all of these inequalities that have been happening and that maybe we have not addressed. So, for example, the big urban-rural divide in terms of social services, also economic disparities, lack of education, sanitary measures, and things like that. So you have areas that are very, very highly developed and that are managing this much more readily than you have in maybe rural areas, that while you do have a great health system, you may not have access to water, you may not have access to online connectivity that would allow education to take place, or that allow economies to bounce more resilience. And a big issue that we're facing is also the uncertainty in terms of economics. So in Mexico, for example, we're very dependent on manufacturing. We're a country that's extremely open, and we are very much dependent on the US economy, but we also export a lot. So that has been heavily hit. We're also an oil exporter. So, of course, the oil prices and the less of demand because of travel has hit our economy greatly. We're also the third country in the world that receives the most remittances. In some states, it can be up to 5% of the economy. But of course, that's probably undercounting what it means to household incomes, because these remittances do act as a welfare system.
Right,
so that, of course, has been hard. So
yes, thank you for mentioning that, because it's very important for all of us. Europe also is thinking about, reacting on this crisis we are all expecting to have. So the economic measures and the reactions of the governments, and what they propose to help the businesses and to boost the economy is now key among issues discussed in Europe as well. So, if you can just tell us a little bit more about this economic side. Vietnam is one of the rising stars, we would say, now in Asia, is catching up quite quickly. You also have been able to develop quite an important tourism industry. So how the situation now looks like, and what is the government proposing to help the economy, and to boost it again?
So like other countries elsewhere in the world, the pandemic really dealt a huge blow to our economy. So for this year, experts estimate that we're gonna have our GDP gonna reduce by at least 2 to 3%. So from the expected about 7% of GDP growth, it will be 4 or 5% only. And the sector that will be hardly hit is tourism. We base tourism sector contributes quite a great number to the economy. But now, as all the countries around the world close the borders, and we ourselves had to close borders to foreign tourists, so the tourist sector was really hardly hit, and about 90% of people working in the sector lost their jobs, either temporarily or permanently. So it is really, it has dealt a really huge blow to the economy. And also because we are exporting a lot of products to like Europe and the United States are one of our largest trading partners, and importing a lot of products from us. So the fact that they are all hit by the pandemic really caused us a lot of difficulties. Our manufacturers, companies in producing and exporting the products, and also we largely depend on China for the materials. A lot of our materials for production comes from China. So when China was in turbulence because of the pandemic in January and February, our supply chain was disrupted. So a lot of companies struggle to find materials for production. So it also affects our economy a lot. So since the pandemic, since this happened, the government tried to help the business communities by like announcing about like 0.5% of the GDP worth of fiscal stimulus measures, including like tax cuts and the extension of tax payments. And the government also proposed some additional fiscal stimulus measures, including direct payments to some individuals, and they also subsidize the electricity price, reducing the electricity price.
Right, I would just I interrupt you because I was surprised also because I just read the new data. There are some countries, 33 big countries, who announced already the GDP result, and Poland is not doing very badly. We are quite happy with our growth still, but Vietnam is doing even better. You have actually still the economic growth at the level of 3.8%. So even more than Indonesia. So that's, first of all, it's good news for you, but it's also a question, how you're doing that. And maybe we in Europe, we also can have some suggestions from your side, because in the European Union also we have 27 countries, and every country reacted slightly in a different way. And there are basically national governments who were thinking about financial help and stimulus packages. So is there anything you particularly think, as being journalists and covering this issue, as working very well in your country?
Actually, because Vietnamese is a very kind of like a very largely open economy. So it is badly affected by the pandemic, but because we also that in the longer term, it is said that we also benefit from the pandemic somehow, because like what we see in China, so China is losing trust of the international communities and as well as the business communities. So in the longer term, it is said that many like companies, many multinational enterprises will like move their production base to elsewhere, and Vietnam will benefit from that. Like since since the trade war between US and China, there is also a movement of moving the production facilities from China to other countries, including Vietnam. And I think the COVID outbreak this time will accelerate that effort to relocate production out of China. And one of the destinations would be our country, would be Vietnam.
It's interesting to notice that you can really benefit out of this new, reflection the European and generally Western companies could have on China. We'll come back to that. Montse, I would like also to ask you the same question. What is exactly, first of all, the economic situation? Because you mentioned inequalities, you mentioned all these challenges, but also how your government is reacting in Mexico and what you see from the wider perspective of Latin America.
I think our region is the perspectives are not very good, as we said. Well, as I mentioned, is the fact that we depend on we depend on tourism, we depend on exports. It is a very outward-looking region, right? And it's very much on commodities, on tourism, and all of these areas will be absolutely badly hit. So, for example, in Mexico, the economic outlook has not been very positive at all. We have been estimated to have a 7.6% reduction, as was calculated by UPS. And in the case of I'm trying to think, I think it was the Bank of America, we actually saw an 8% estimated decrease in terms of our GDP. So it's not going to be good, especially when you look at it in terms of numbers, if you talk about it in informal economies. So we will see a lot of pain being taken into account. The way that this government, so we have a government that is not the traditional government that Mexico has seen in the past. It is much more leftward leaning. So what their response to the economic measures has been quite different. In a way, it's just a different focus. So what they've decided to focus on is a lot about making sure that the social net is protected. So the economic recovery has been to ensure that these social protection services, such as the pensions, such as the cash transfer schemes to the most vulnerable populations, are taking into account, and that the health system has the amount that they need. Granted, this was based on projections that were done in the beginning of the the pandemic. So now, as these budgets are shrinking, of course, many local governments will need to go back to local congresses to be able to have new budgets approved. And this is probably something that at a national level is going to be taken. Some stimulus programs have been put in place, especially by the Bank of Mexico, that has begun to favor a lot of support and easy credit to small, medium business enterprises, and that has allowed more liquidity to be up into the market. However, what we fear is that it won't be enough, because the impact is so great. In other countries, there has been a lot more fiscal stimulus, a lot more measures have tried to is economic expansion. But in Mexico, that has not been the case. In Mexico, what has happened is that in order to finance these stimulus proposals, is that the government is actually decreasing their own budget in terms of current accounts. So, for example, we're seeing that public functionaries will probably have wages cut, benefits cut, programs that are maybe not considered essential for these social services will also probably have their budgets slashed. It's a very, very different approach to what we have been used to.
Yes.
Not sure if it's going to work considering the crisis, but let's see. I mean, in one case, we do feel that you do need to prioritize the most vulnerable, but again, is it enough?
I thank you for that. I am very happy that we have some followers on the Facebook who have questions to you, and I encourage all the people who are listening to put the questions. First, still to Montse and then to Ha, can you describe a little bit more the situation of small businesses also, and especially these sectors who are the most hit, like tourism, restaurants, dressers, all these little businesses, and what is the pressure? Is there any pressure from the business side to open up quicker the economy? Montse and then Ha, the same question.
Yes, so I actually live in an area that is very much local cafes, that has a lot of restaurants, and that actually the months of March and April are the highest peak. And I know quite a couple that have had to close down completely just because they weren't making ends meet. And there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what will the support be to these businesses. I think the main thing that the government is counting on is that these development banks, because we do have an active development bank situation in Mexico, is that they will be able to provide easy credits. This is important because in Latin America, there is not a lot of access to credits to these small businesses. There's a lot of fear of financial risks, right? So being able to tap into these credits, I think, is something that will provide a relief. However, this hasn't been flowing necessarily as of yet. So ask me maybe in a couple of weeks. So there is, and I'm looking at the questions right now, there is very little political consensus. So as I mentioned, we have right now a very politically divided country. And you can see this being magnified in terms of the responses.
Yeah, that's another question we are having about more political, environment. How is if we have really a consensus about the measure adopted, not only in the economy, generally speaking. I understand that it's also about healthcare, lockdown, and all these restrictions.
Yeah, so there is absolutely no political consensus here. I mean, while the governing party has the majority of the Congress, they have the majority of the local governments, and they also, of course, have the presidents. There is, and if you look to civil society and if you look at the business community, they are not feeling that their concerns are being taken into account. So, for example, you're seeing that this is also an interesting thing because you're seeing that these business groups are kind of preparing their own responses. So luckily, there are business groups that are consolidated. So you have the banking associations, you have the business councils, and they're looking to help up with their own members to see what their responses will be, because they're not seeing this response or this uptake from their concerns by the government themselves. So it's becoming very uncoordinated in a way, and I fear that this is something that we will see in terms of the repercussions. On the upside, however, it might also provide an opportunity to create an increased participation of civil society and an empowerment of these groups in being able to lead a way forward. So, for example, we have a great example is that the business community and the bank associations of Mexico actually look to the IADB to take on some debt themselves to allow for these stimulus to the SMEs and credit lines and emergency funds reliefs to be able to help as well. And this is the civil society taking on these own loans through this private sector window that IADB or that the World Bank may actually have. So this is another response that kind of shows to the fact that while there is no political consensus, the fact that you do have these associative processes that will provide maybe an alternative way on how we solve what this economic fallout will be.
That's very interesting observation, and of course, the political scene in Mexico is very vibrant. In Vietnam, we have a different situation because I presume political consensus is there because you have the different political system. But maybe as far as the society is concerned, also people have some comments. So both these questions I would address now to you about first these pressure from small and medium-sized businesses, especially tourism, cafes, restaurants, and etc. Plus, generally, what is the society feeling about what's going on in your country? Is the government handling it well?
Medium businesses communities are had this hit among during the pandemic. So as the cases elsewhere, because we also experienced about like 3 weeks of social distancing. So all of the businesses, including restaurants, shops, hotels, have asked to close, and so many people lost their jobs, and many businesses have gone bankrupt and have to close down. But one thing that is different in Vietnam, because maybe due to the political system, so the hand of the government is heavy, and people are more accepting to like the government's orders. So and another reason is because the government has been doing a very good job in containing the pandemic. So people, even the business community, still think like approve with the government in the way they handle the pandemic, and they also think of their responsibility to like cooperate with the government. So there is not like any kind of like campaign to ask for governments to open up the economy, and because in Vietnam, maybe of the confusion culture of collectivism and group identity, so people are quite somehow, we can say, like obedience to the government's orders. So yeah.
Okay. And now let's a little bit change the subject, because now I want to look a little bit broadly at the world, and I would be very curious about hearing from you. What's your perspective about the future, or about this new normal? You mentioned that you are having already this new normal. We are all wondering how this new normal will look like, and I would like to ask first Montse, could you, because you've mentioned the inequalities, you mentioned social programs, you've mentioned all these things. Maybe now some politicians, pay much more attention to than earlier. In European Union, in Europe, definitely we are having a lot of reflection on that. We are thinking about healthcare systems. We are thinking of better coordination of work among the member state countries. So what would be, in your opinion, this world of the future, or maybe we can say the world of today already? First, as far as the society and the priorities of the countries. I'm not talking about your country only. I'm talking about the larger reflection the world can has. Montserrat.
So yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for us, because when you have huge disruptors like we're having now at a global scale, it does allow us to see what are the impacts of things that we've been measuring in development as a whole. And it kind of shows the fact that what are the stakes of not attending to this? How do we make a world that is much more resilient? How do we make resilient economies? And I think what the COVID situation does, it allows for opportunities to think, okay, so we have an opportunity to rebuild. Let's rebuild better. So what does rebuilding better means? I think it begins to think about what are the vulnerabilities, including, as we mentioned, inequalities, as we mentioned also the linkages between ecosystem degradation, between also looking to the fact that maybe value changes that are not resilient, and maybe looking to these new economies. So for example, I'm looking at one of the questions, it talks about artificial intelligence. So while I can't say specifically the fact of the artificial intelligence, it does kind of point us to the fact is, how do we begin to tether a new technologies such as TICs, or technological and communication information services that do allow us to kind of remain connected and be very smart to having options that are very much end user focused. So I think it has created new economic opportunities for value changes that are seeing the way that they have to reformulate themselves. Education as well is a big one. I know the World Bank and the IDB are investing heavily in terms of remote learning and making sure that this connectivity lag is attended to, because, well, yes, if you go to a private school, or if your son goes to a private school, you will be able to kind of access to this online learning. But what happens in rural communities where maybe there is no connectivity services? I'm looking, for example, some of the projects that I am helping advise, and saying, as the more rural they are, the harder it is for them to get back to this new normality. And then these inequalities will become greater. So let's look to begin to investing these services these communication services that I think are now as essential as maybe the basic services such as energy were in the past. Well, now we need to think about online connectivity to be able to reduce these inequality gaps. And also I think there's also this fear that because the economic impacts are so huge, let's now regain all the ground and do sort of what the US is doing. And it's rolling back a lot of environmental protection laws. Well, this comes to our own detriment, because that is creating an even less resilient way forward. So maybe we're going to look at how to work with ecosystems and how to make ourselves grow in a way that is not predatory to their environment, because we do need the environment to kind of help us prevent these outbreaks. I mean, there has been a lot of research kind of linking to the fact that the more environmental degradation, the more propense we are to these huge health situations. And in fact, one of the papers that I read just recently was saying that the Amazon is going to become now a local hotspot to maybe to a new pandemics, because you don't have these ecosystem services providing protection as you used to have. So I think it does allow, and I would invite a lot of people to look to the UNDP webpage to see what has been done to help countries rebuild and look at this COVID crisis, not only as a health crisis, but also to the huge development impact it's doing, and look to alternative options and how to rebuild a lot better.
Right. Thank you very much to mention Amazon, because we know also that, you know, the local people there have particularly huge problems with somehow surviving during pandemic, because, you know, the immune system is not really strong. So that's one thing. And second is, of course, the forest, and we are all interested in, you know, generally in the environment ecosystem in the world. So this was the topic number one just before the pandemic. Now it seems that it still remains, because many people discovered that what pandemic did was a little bit better air, that, you know, somehow we can breathe with a fresh air in many places. This was not the case. And in European Union, we also have this reflection to combine the two, the Green Deal we are having in the European Union and the development, the growth of the economies we want now to, you know, focus on. So it has to be somehow a combined effort. We have a question from Mr. Stashinsky, who is asking about these two regions and WHO, and we know that we have some difficulties, and especially the US also is rejecting to contribute anymore to this organization. So the question would be, are there any local initiative, maybe regional cooperation among countries, not necessarily only in the healthcare system, but more regional help the countries give to each other? I would start with Ha, maybe, and I would like also you to comment on this environment and, you know, the new normal. Ha, are you with us?
Yeah. So you were asking about whether there is a regional mechanism in our region to cope with the pandemic, right?
Well, as I understand, the question is also about what to do if the international global organization doesn't deliver well, or at least some countries make objections, and maybe it's, you know, too global. Maybe the answer for this would be to create some lower level regional cooperation of countries in such circumstances.
Well, from Vietnam's perspective, actually we have the ASEAN region, and comprising of 10 nations in the Southeast Asian region. But actually, when the talking about the pandemic, the ASEAN has held a lot of talk regarding this problem. But as far as I see, I don't see really like effective measures, like concerted efforts of the whole region in dealing with the pandemic. But often than not, it was like each individual country's efforts to deal with the pandemic itself. So in the region that I am living in Southeast Asian, I don't really see any like kind of effective cooperation mechanism in dealing with this issue.
Right, but you are right. Yeah. You mentioned, thank you very much for reminding us, there is ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian States, with 10 members, with Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Brunei, Myanmar. So it's really an influential organization. And maybe, do you think it could make this organization working even better? Is this the platform to build somehow a closer cooperation also in such issues like pandemic?
Yeah, I hope it will be the case in the future. But up until now, I think it's more rhetoric than really some concrete efforts like in place to deal with the pandemic. But yes, of course, as a citizen of ASEAN, I would love to see if the countries can sit together and doing more like meaningful things to cooperate with each other.
That's what we hope also to do in the European Union. We are much more integrated than ASEAN, of course. We are not a state, but we are almost a kind of a confederation. So exactly now do you have the discussions in the European Union what to do to take lessons from this pandemic, where we didn't really, at the beginning at least, we didn't really cooperate well. So coming back to the question about this new normal, do you see, as a journalist also, maybe you can tell us what is the public debate on that? It must be definitely many people discussing the future and how to take lessons from pandemic and how to change our working style, our society maybe measures. So how do you visualize this new normal?
I think definitely the world will change forever after this pandemic, and people are like talking about the new terms of before COVID and after COVID, and surely the COVID pandemic has forced the governments to intervene more in the economy and the daily life of people in a way that was like unprecedented in the past. The pandemic will also change the economy, the nature of the economy. I think it will lead to a shake-up in the service sector, especially in some high social contact areas, such as in like tourism, leisure industry, which are dominated by small businesses and the low-paid and self-employed people, and I think the huge cost, huge cost in terms of human loss and economic toll of the pandemics will also push much more investment in health research and the health issues will certainly top the agenda and add to the urgency of addressing other global threats to sustainability. As the pandemic has forced many countries to lock down, and people are forced to stay at home, working from home. So so people will there will be the trend from changing from physical contact to digital contact, and people will be interacting more digitally, learning online, working online. So it will, of course, radically shake up the structure of the economy. So more and more things will go online from now, and also the new normality will change people's thoughts, people thinking about how we relate to the family, our household, to our neighbors and our communities in terms in facing of the new situation.
And it's also thinking, I'm thinking that we have a new normal also in these kind of things we are doing right now. Live talks, we are able to connect 3 continents, North America, Europe, and Asia without any problem. And that's fantastic that we are able to do that. And I would like also to ask you about the future in political terms. Montserrat, how do you think, you personally, but also people in Mexico, maybe you can also tell us a little bit more about the public debate. in your country. How do you see the future of this tension between the US and China? And of course, I presume you are so close to the US economy that you are also quite worried about what is happening in the US itself.
So, well, I think what has happened is that this crisis has kind of proven the value to me of international organizations and of international governance systems, right? So one of the key things was the ability to create these international dashboards that were allowing you to kind of measure what things were happening from various countries as they were advancing. And I think this is something that has become a lot clearer, particularly to political disruptors who felt that they weren't as important, and they have now gained a new relevance, because it has created the possibility for organized forums. So, for example, there were the WHO discussions that went on this week, and while of course consensus is lacking, and the politicization between countries has gone on, because of course everyone needs someone to blame. It is concerning, I think, for all of us, because countries, particularly middle-income countries like ours, we kind of, part of our voice comes from these multi-development agencies and governance systems. So for the UN, Mexico is extremely active in the UN, and we have a lot of international lawyers that are very well regarded, and we know these systems because it allows these countries to kind of have a voice. And especially now, as you're beginning to see all of this research coming out, and the concept, the idea of how the vaccines will be distributed and things like that, having an organization like WHO takes a lot of relevance. So I think the concern that we may see is having a country like the US disrupt the system in a way that they will pull themselves out when they're such an important player. I mean, we also saw yesterday that one of a US laboratory is being very successful in terms of the beginnings of the human testing. So, I mean, you kind of do need all the players to come together. So I think there's concern in the fact that now that we're seeing the relevance in these crisis situations of having these international governance mechanisms, that countries will take their own political considerations and just basically pull out when you kind of need this coordinated efforts as much.
But that's exactly that's the problem, because you are having this perception that these international organizations are now so important, but there are also other people, Donald Trump first. And also we have this question on the floor here on our Facebook that's exactly the opposite. That's the moment where the international organization proved that they don't work properly.
Well, it depends. So here it is. I think it is. It doesn't work properly when you begin to, when you have, the problem is that this situation came when you were having all of this global disruptions, right? So it's kind of put them to the test. But however, one of the things that is very interesting is when you compare how these leaders are reacting versus to what their populations are actually wanting. And it's a very different picture. So you can also kind of begin to measure how politicians are being rated throughout this crisis. And you're beginning to see that local governments and that national governments, such as in the case of New Zealand, such as in the case of Australia, that are being Germany, I think, is another example, that are being seen as being very effective to the crisis. And whereas you're seeing other countries where they're not seen as so effective because it's just been so incredibly politicized. So in the way is, I think, is you see a relevance for these forums. The problem is when maybe not all actors are wanting to act as the population would want them to act to manage this crisis. I do want to mention one thing, because I think one of the questions that was mentioned in terms of the regionality, I think that's also been very interesting. I think right now that the crisis has not allowed, at least in my region, we are a region that's very rich and has a lot of great experiences and mechanisms for South-South cooperation. that because the crisis is still so ongoing and it's still very active, we haven't been able to kind of look to each other. But I do think that as this begins to play out, regional approaches will become a lot more relevant, because I think also the definition of communities will become a lot more relevant. And also when we talk about the resilience of the value chains, will become also a lot, it will be a discussion that will be worth having.
Right. And you didn't answer my question about the US, which is an US-China rivalry or competition.
So I think that's what I mentioned, is I think the concern from countries like mine is the fact is when you begin to take these rivalries into organizations that need to work, that's the concern so much. I think we're seeing it much more in a way is Mexico being such a global player and being very dependent and being very active in these international governance forums. What we're seeing is these rivalries that are very political, what their impact will be in disrupting these governance systems that need to act, that need to respond, that need to begin to take into all of these lessons learned, and saying that they will be disrupted by these very short-term political considerations. So I think the concern has to do more with that.
All right. And I would like also to put the same question to you, of course, the US, China, but also especially China. You are so next door, so you are the neighbor. What is your perception of China after the pandemic or during the pandemic? Did they gain some points or did they lose in the perception in Southeast Asian countries? And how do you see this competition between China and US?
US-China relations were already heated, right, before the pandemic, and all of this happened, and I think it's kind of like threw fuel onto a burning flames, and as the Donald Trump administration is trying to because this is the election year, and they have not done so well in dealing with the pandemic. So I think partly because Trump administrations wants to pin the blame of for all aspects of this pandemic on China. It's kind of a blame game. So it will escalate in the weeks, in the time to come, and meanwhile, Beijing, the leaders in China perceive this to be like in line with the Washington's long-term efforts to contain China's influence and to contain its growth as a superpower, the world's superpower, and now Beijing's defense in the face of criticism all over the world about how they handle the pandemic has led it to adopt a new and like more combative diplomatic tone. They call what happened now, how the countries are reacting to China in terms of the virus as like part of the conspiracy theories, and it is like Americans' effort to tarnish the image of China in the world community. So I think this whole crisis will not transform the relationship between the US and China in a positive way, but rather it will accelerate the competition between the two countries, and how it will unfold in the future will depend on how this pandemic, how it ends, how the both countries and the global as a whole recover from the pandemic, how the economic recovery would go, and who will recover faster, and who win the election in the United States.
So you mentioned that in the US this factor of elections is very much pending, but coming back to China, in the Vietnamese people perspective, China was handling the whole situation well. So you are much rather, in the position to tell us that you know, China is an example to follow, or you much rather would have some doubts and people are skeptic as far as the China's position after this pandemic?
Not it's a bit strange in terms of this pandemic. Normally, like Vietnamese people are really skeptical about China because we had a very long history of being hostile to each other, and China has invaded Vietnam for a long time, and it's kind of the nature that Vietnamese people are always skeptical of China. But talking about this pandemic, actually, there's not really a public debate about like China is doing a bad job in terms of dealing with pandemic. Actually, we are somehow following the China's way of China's measures to containing this pandemic, the way the government reacts to the pandemic, and the government has taken very drastic measures, and it somehow replicate what Chinese government has done, like joining off the areas with the positive cases and putting people in quarantine to contain the spread of the virus. So in Vietnam, we don't really downplay the Chinese government's role in dealing with the pandemic, with the virus inside China.
I'm asking also because for us Europeans, you know, it's a hot issue we are discussing. With the European Union also, we are discussing, you know, both the ways of handling the crisis by both China and the US. We are also very worried about this competition being now very tough. We are also thinking about the future, and we are feeling that we are a place where there is a battle. You know, it's like a battlefield as far as the information war. But there is a strong propaganda from the Chinese side to try to put us into their perspective. But the American reaction also seems to us sometimes a little bit too exaggerated. So Europe is looking for, you know, some position in the middle of these two. And I would like, that's my final question to both of you. Can you tell us a little bit about Europe, if there is any discussion or any comment on what is European Union or EU countries are doing and what is happening in the European continent? Montse, maybe you will start.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back, before I tackle that, I wanted to go back to, because I think you talked on a very important point, and I think what this has also kind of brought us is the relevance of information. How important how governance systems affect your perception of the trustworthy of the information, right? So I think that part of it, when you talk about this propaganda war, and we're seeing it from everywhere, is, well, there's an information overload. At the same time, there's a lot of distrust in the information that's been here. Mexico's been having a huge debate in terms of how credible its numbers are. And I think that in China, this is something that's been recurrent. And I think in a lot of the countries as well. So I think one of the issues that countries need to consider going forward is the importance of having transparent information almost as a governance, as a governance institution into itself, because a lot of governments aren't seen as credible enough, and that their data is not considered to be true. And so you're having all of these conspiracy theories, and you're having these kind of dirty wars when it comes to information propaganda. And it's going to become extremely relevant as elections in a lot of places take forward, particularly in the US elections as well. In terms of Europe, how we're perceiving Europe is, we do consider Europe to be a credible information source. We're not so much in the US. China, there's a lot of debate as well in terms of the numbers that are being said and the transparency of how it managed the outbreak. But I think Europe is considered almost as the responsible adult in the group, in what we call it, into the international governance systems. We are looking to see how Italy and Germany are beginning to reopen their economies. This is something that a lot of policymakers are looking into. What are the different mixtures, or what are the different responses, and how their indicators are measuring. So the way that Mexico is reopening its economy, it's doing it by rating in terms of infection cases. So those that have very low infections, those will be able to reopen ahead of it. So we're going through a tiered approach, and that tiered approach is going to be very much informed on those best practices that Europe is managing. There is a lot of concern in terms of the fact that we open up, but that we open up responsibly. So I remember, so one of the questions that we also had in the chat was, is there a lot of pressure from the business side to begin to open? And the response is not really, because there's a lot of fear of opening up and then having to close back all the way up again, because of course all of this creates cost in terms of chain productions and things like that. So Europe is seen almost as a best practice scenario on how we should move forward. We do think that the Europeans' variances in responses has been very informative, and I know that there's a lot of cooperation in terms of health research, technology, how there's responses. So I do have a couple of friends that are doctors, and they are communicating with Italian colleagues, with Spanish colleagues. So the good thing is, in this information flows, when it comes to technical information by technical people, this has actually helped inform decisions going forward. So
thank you very much. That's very encouraging to us Europeans, that we are still seen as a reliable adult in the group. Last words go to you. How do you perceive Europe from the Vietnamese perspective?
From the Vietnamese perspective, it's a bit different from what Montserrat has just shared. Actually, the pandemic has kind of somehow changed the Vietnamese perception towards Europe in particular, and like the Western world in general. Like before, all of the Vietnamese people will like look up to the first world, like the so-called first world countries in Europe or the United States, as they possessing many things that us here don't have. But as the pandemic unfold, people now like are seeing that many countries in Europe and in the Western world are failing in the fight against the pandemic somehow. So for the Vietnamese people, they think that because the European and the Western countries are like overconfident in their state-of-the-art healthcare system. So at the first place, the leaders there like kind of ignore the threat of the virus, and they acted so a bit late, and even when they were forced to act, they sent mixed signal to the citizens. So that encouraged many to act in ways that make the infection spread, and also because in the European countries somehow lack of experience in dealing with infectious disease like we do, because here or in like developing countries, we can kind of have a lot of experience in dealing with infectious disease like for example, SARS, measles, dengue fever. So we are here doing quite well because we have more experience, and also because of the kind of like cultural behavior. People in Europe and people in the Western countries, the attitudes towards governance and community consciousness is a bit different from like Asia's people. So people like favor the kind of individual freedom over the kind of community responsibility. So maybe that's why here, like we still seeing reports of people in Europe going out, partying, going to seaside, despite the lockdown order by the government. Things like that have changed the people's in the Vietnamese people perception towards Europe.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's interesting to observe that both of you shared some discussion also we are having in the middle of Europe and European Union, because some Europeans also see our deficits, but definitely we are convinced we have measures also to repair and take lessons from this crisis to somehow, correct certain deficits we've just discovered in the European Union. Thank you very much, both of you, for these perspectives. It was really interesting to hear your voice here, being in Warsaw and in Poland. It's not so often that we have such a debate on 3 continents. So thank you very much for sharing the time. Thank you all the people who are following us on the Facebook and for all your comments and questions. Thank you all for watching us every Tuesday. Thanks also Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, with whom we are doing these series. And I hope to see you again next Tuesday. Thank you. Goodbye.